The final bell at Riverside Academy had just echoed through the empty corridors when Maria Rodriguez felt the first shiver of unease crawl up her spine. She had been walking toward the faculty parking lot, her worn leather messenger bag slung over her shoulder, when she noticed the deliberate footsteps behind her. Not the hurried shuffle of students eager to catch their buses, but something more calculated, more menacing. As a substitute teacher, Maria had learned to trust her instincts, and right now, every alarm bell in her head was screaming danger. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. What Maria didn't know was that her background as a former police officer was about to collide with the toxic culture of entitlement that had been festering at this prestigious private school for years. What started as another routine day filling in for Mrs. Henderson's chemistry classes was about to become a confrontation that would expose corruption, challenge authority, and prove that sometimes the most unexpected heroes emerge from the most ordinary circumstances. Maria Rodriguez had always believed that teaching was her calling, even during her 12 years on the police force. The transition from patrol officer to substitute teacher hadn't been easy, especially after the incident that forced her early retirement, but she found solace in the classroom. At 42, she possessed a rare combination of patience and authority that most educators spent years trying to develop. Her dark hair was always pulled back in a practical bun, and her sharp brown eyes missed nothing. Students often commented that she had an unusual way of commanding respect without raising her voice, though none of them knew the source of that quiet confidence. Riverside Academy stood like a monument to privilege on the outskirts of the wealthy Brookhaven district. Its red brick facade and ivy-covered walls spoke of tradition and exclusivity, while the perfectly manicured grounds suggested the kind of resources that most public schools could only dream of. The tuition here exceeded what many families earned in a year, and the student body reflected that reality. Mercedes and BMWs filled the student parking lot, designer backpacks were standard issue, and the latest smartphones were as common as pencils. Maria had been substitute teaching for 3 years now, moving between different schools in the district, but Riverside Academy was new territory for her. The pay was better than the public schools, and she needed every extra dollar she could. Yet, her police pension helped, but it wasn't enough to cover her mortgage and her mother's medical bills. When the call came from the district office asking if she could cover for Mrs. Henderson, who had suddenly fallen ill, Maria hadn't hesitated to accept. Her first morning at Riverside had been unremarkable in the best possible way. The chemistry. Students were well behaved, if somewhat entitled, and she'd managed to guide them through their lab exercises without any major incidents. The faculty she'd met seemed professional enough, though she detected an undercurrent of tension in their interactions that she couldn't quite place. During lunch, she'd eaten alone in the teacher's lounge, observing the social dynamics that played out around her. It was Dr. Patricia Whitman, the assistant principal, who first mentioned the 3 students that would soon change Maria's life. Dr. Whitman was a thin, nervous woman in her 50s who spoke in quick, clipped sentences and constantly adjusted her wire-rimmed glasses. She had approached Maria during the lunch break, clipboard in hand, and worry lines etched deep around her eyes. "Ms. Rodriguez," Dr. Whitman had said, lowering her voice conspiratorially, "I wanted to give you a heads up about some of our more challenging students. You might encounter them in the hallways or during passing periods. There's Jake Morrison, Tyler Webb, and Connor Sullivan. They're all seniors, all on the varsity lacrosse team, and they have a tendency to test new faculty members." Maria had looked up from her sandwich, noting the careful way Dr. Whitman chose her words. "Test how?" "They like to see how far they can push boundaries," Dr. Whitman had explained, fidgeting with her pen. Nothing serious, mind you, just typical teenage behavior taken a bit too far. Their families are very involved with the school, so we try to handle any issues internally. I just thought you should be aware. The warning had struck Maria as odd, particularly the emphasis on handling things internally, but she'd simply nodded and filed the information away. In her experience, both as a police officer and as an educator, advance warnings about problematic individuals usually proved accurate. She'd made a mental note to watch for these 3 students and to trust her instincts if any interactions felt off. The afternoon classes had proceeded smoothly until the final period. Maria was covering an advanced placement chemistry class, and the students were working on a complex titration experiment. The lab was filled with the soft bubbling of reactions and the quiet murmur of student conversations when Jake Morrison first caught her attention. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with the kind of athletic build that suggested countless hours in the weight room. His blonde hair was perfectly styled despite the safety goggles he was supposed to be wearing, which instead hung loosely around his neck. He moved through the lab with an air of casual arrogance, clearly expecting the world to bend to his will. When Maria approached his station to check his progress, she immediately noticed that he and his lab partner had skipped several crucial steps in the procedure. "Jake," she said calmly, "you'll need to start over. You've missed the preliminary measurements, and without those, your results won't be accurate." Jake looked up at her with surprise, as if he couldn't believe she was actually correcting him. "It's fine," he said dismissively. "I've done this experiment before. I know what I'm doing." Maria maintained her composure, though she recognized the challenge in his tone. "I'm sure you're capable, but the assignment requires following the specific methodology outlined in your lab manual. Please start again." A flash of irritation crossed Jake's face, but he was clearly calculating whether to push the issue further. After a moment, he shrugged and began cleaning his equipment, though his movements were deliberately slow and exaggerated. Maria made a note of the interaction, but didn't let it escalate. She'd dealt with far more serious challenges during her police career. As the period continued, she became aware of 2 other students who seemed to be watching her interactions with Jake with unusual interest. Tyler Webb was a stocky redhead with freckles and an easy smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. He had the kind of face that suggested mischief, and Maria noticed that he kept whispering to his lab partner while glancing in her direction. Connor Sullivan was leaner than his friends, with dark hair and sharp features that gave him an almost predatory appearance. He worked quietly at his station, but Maria could feel his gaze on her throughout the class. When the final bell rang, most students packed up quickly, eager to start their afternoon activities or head home. Jake, Tyler, and Connor, however, took their time gathering their materials. They lingered near their stations, engaging in what appeared to be casual conversation, but Maria's trained observation skills told her otherwise. Their body language suggested they were coordinating something, and their frequent glances in her direction confirmed that she was the subject of their discussion. Maria finished cleaning up the lab equipment and organizing the materials for the next day's classes. The chemistry department at Riverside was well funded, with state-of-the-art equipment and supplies that many universities would envy. As she worked, she found herself thinking about Dr. Whitman's warning and wondering what exactly these 3 students were planning. The school began to empty as buses departed and parents arrived for pickup. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Maria gathered her belongings and headed toward the faculty parking lot, her mind already shifting to the evening ahead. She had papers to grade from her regular teaching position at Lincoln Middle School, and she wanted to review Mrs. Henderson's Lesson plans for the next day. The extra income from substituting at Riverside was helpful, but it meant longer days and more work to juggle. As she walked down the main corridor, her footsteps echoing in the increasingly quiet building, Maria noticed how different Riverside felt compared to the public schools where she usually worked. The walls were lined with portraits of distinguished alumni and photographs of championship athletic teams. Trophy cases gleamed under the fluorescent lights, displaying decades of academic and athletic achievements. Everything about the environment spoke of success and privilege, but Maria couldn't shake the feeling that something darker lurked beneath the polished surface. She was passing the main administrative office when she heard raised voices coming from behind the closed door of Principal Morrison's office. The name Morrison immediately caught her attention. Wasn't that Jake's last name? She slowed her pace, not intending to eavesdrop, but finding it difficult not to overhear the heated conversation taking place just a few feet away. "This is the third complaint this month," a woman's voice was saying, though Maria couldn't identify the speaker. "The Hendersons are threatening to pull their donation if we don't address this situation." "The Hendersons can complain all they want," came a deeper voice that Maria assumed belonged to Principal Morrison. "But they need to understand that these boys are crucial to our lacrosse program. We're ranked second in the state, and college scouts are watching. A few minor disciplinary issues aren't worth jeopardizing that kind of exposure." "Minor disciplinary issues?" The woman's voice rose in pitch. "Jake threw a desk during English class last week. Tyler was caught cheating on his settees, and Connor was found with alcohol in his locker. How is any of that minor?" "Look, Patricia," Principal Morrison said, and Maria realized she was listening to a conversation between him and Dr. Whitman. "I understand your concerns, but we have to consider the bigger picture. The Morrison family has contributed over $200,000 to this school in the past 5 years alone. The Webbs funded our new computer lab, and the Sullivans practically built our athletic complex. We can't just ignore those relationships because of some teenage growing pains." Maria felt a chill of recognition as the pieces began falling into place. Jake Morrison wasn't just another entitled student, he was the principal's son. The 3 boys Dr. Whitman had warned her about weren't just protected by their athletic status. They were shielded by family wealth and political connections that made them virtually untouchable within the school's ecosystem. She quickened her pace, not wanting to be caught eavesdropping, but her mind was racing with the implications of what she'd overheard. During her years on the police force, she'd encountered similar situations where wealth and influence created a different set of rules for certain individuals. The pattern was always the same. Minor infractions were overlooked, complaints were dismissed, and anyone who pushed too hard found themselves marginalized or pushed out entirely. The parking lot was nearly empty when Maria finally reached her car, a reliable but aging Honda Civic that stood out among the luxury vehicles that typically filled the faculty spaces. As she fumbled with her keys, she noticed a black SUV with tinted windows parked near the exit. The engine was running, and though she couldn't see inside clearly, she had the distinct impression that someone was watching her. Maria's police training kicked in automatically. She made a mental note of the vehicle's license plate and position while appearing to focus on her own car. The SUV was positioned in a way that would allow whoever was inside to observe both the main building and the parking lot exits. After 12 years of law enforcement, she recognized surveillance when she saw it. As she started her car and began backing out of her parking space, the SUV's engine revved slightly, and she saw it begin to move. Maria felt her heart rate increase as she realized she was being followed. She drove slowly toward the main exit, watching her rearview mirror carefully. The SUV maintained a discreet distance, but definitely seemed to be trailing her. At the first traffic light outside the school, Maria made a sudden right turn without signaling, a technique she'd learned during her police academy training for detecting surveillance. The SUV hesitated for a moment before making the same turn, confirming her suspicions. Someone was definitely following her, and given the timing and location, it was almost certainly connected to her interactions with Jake Morrison and his friends. Maria's mind raced through her options. She could try to lose the tail, but that might escalate the situation unnecessarily. She could confront whoever was following her, but without backup, that seemed unwise. Instead, she decided to take a route that would lead her past the local police station, hoping that the familiar territory might discourage her followers or at least provide her with options if the situation escalated. The SUV continued following her for several more blocks before suddenly breaking off and disappearing into traffic. Maria felt some of the tension leave her shoulders, but she remained alert for the rest of her drive home. She varied her route and made several unexpected turns, techniques that had become second nature during her law enforcement career. By the time she reached her modest duplex on the other side of town, she was reasonably confident that she hadn't been followed further. As she sat in her driveway with the engine running, Maria tried to process what had happened. It seemed almost surreal that a simple day of substitute teaching could have led to such a bizarre situation. She thought about the conversation she'd overheard between Principal Morrison and Dr. Whitman, the strange behavior of the three students, and now this apparent surveillance. The pieces suggested a level of corruption and entitlement that went far beyond typical teenage misbehavior. Maria turned off her car and gathered her belongings. But before going inside, she took a moment to survey her surroundings. Her neighborhood was quiet and middle class, a far cry from the wealth and privilege of Riverside Academy. Her duplex was small but comfortable, with a tiny front yard that she kept meticulously maintained. It was the kind of place where people minded their own business but looked out for each other, and she'd always felt safe there. Inside, Maria set her bags down and immediately went to her home office, where she kept detailed records of her substitute teaching assignments. She'd learned during her police career that documentation was crucial, and she applied the same principle to her current work. She opened a new file on her computer and began typing up everything she could remember about her first day at Riverside Academy. She documented her conversations with Dr. Whitman, her interactions with Jake Morrison and his friends, the overheard conversation between the principal and assistant principal, and the apparent surveillance in the parking lot. As she wrote, she found herself slipping back into the investigative mindset that had served her well during her law enforcement career. Patterns began emerging, connections became clearer, and she started to see the larger picture of what she might be dealing with. The phone rang just as she was finishing her notes, and Maria glanced at the caller ID with surprise. It was her former partner from the police force, Detective Sarah Chen. They'd maintained a friendship after Maria's retirement, but Sarah rarely called during weekday evenings unless something was wrong. "Hey, Sarah," Maria answered. What's going on?" "That's what I was hoping you could tell me," Sarah replied, her voice tight with concern. "I just got a weird call from someone asking about you. They wanted to know about your background, your service record, whether you had any ongoing investigations or connections to local families." Maria felt her stomach drop. "What did you tell them?" "Nothing, obviously. I told them that personnel information was confidential and hung up. But Maria, whoever called, had some specific details about your current employment. They knew you were substitute teaching, and they mentioned Riverside Academy by name. Do you know what this might be about?" Maria quickly filled Sarah in on the events of the day, from her interactions with the three students to the surveillance in the parking lot. As she spoke, she could hear Sarah taking notes, her detective instincts kicking in, just as Maria's had. "This sounds bigger than just some spoiled rich kids acting out," Sarah said when Maria finished. "If someone's making calls about your background, They're either trying to intimidate you or they're looking for leverage. Either way, it suggests you've stumbled into something significant. That's what I'm thinking too, Maria agreed. The question is, what do I do about it? I need this job, Sarah. The substitute pay from Riverside is helping me keep up with Mum's medical bills. I understand that, but your safety comes first. These people clearly have resources and connections if they're able to track down my contact information and call about you within hours of your first day there. Promise me you'll be careful. Maria promised to stay alert and to keep Sarah informed of any developments. After hanging up, she sat in her quiet office, staring at the screen full of notes she'd compiled. Part of her wanted to call the district office and decline any future assignments at Riverside Academy. It would be the smart thing to do, the safe thing to do. But another part of her, the part that had driven her to become a police officer in the first place, was angry at the idea of being intimidated into backing down. She thought about Dr. Whitman's nervous warnings about handling things internally, about Principal Morrison's casual dismissal of serious disciplinary issues, and about the 3 students who seemed to believe they were above any consequences. How many teachers had been driven away from Riverside Academy? How many complaints had been buried or ignored? How many students had been victimized by this toxic culture of privilege and entitlement? Maria's phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. Her heart rate spiked as she read the simple message, "Hope you enjoyed your first day at Riverside. Looking forward to seeing more of you." The message was unsigned, and when she tried to call the number back, it went straight to a disconnected voicemail. She screenshot the message and added it to her growing file of documentation. Whatever game these people were playing, they'd made a critical error in choosing her as their target. They saw a substitute teacher, someone temporary and disposable, someone who would be easy to intimidate or push aside. What they didn't know was that Maria Rodriguez had spent 12 years dealing with criminals, bullies, and corrupt officials. She knew how to investigate, how to gather evidence, and how to build a case. More importantly, she knew how to fight back. Maria spent the rest of the evening reviewing Mrs. Henderson's lesson plans and preparing for her second day at Riverside Academy. She laid out her clothes carefully, choosing an outfit that was professional but allowed for freedom of movement. She checked her car thoroughly, looking for any signs of tampering or tracking devices. She charged her phone completely and made sure her emergency contacts were updated. As she prepared for bed, Maria found herself thinking about the path that had led her to this moment. Her transition from police work to teaching hadn't been by choice. A confrontation with a corrupt supervisor who was taking bribes from local drug dealers had ended her law enforcement career and nearly landed her in prison herself. The department had offered her a choice: resign quietly with her pension intact, or face an internal investigation that would likely destroy her reputation and financial security. She'd chosen to resign, but the experience had left her with a deep understanding of how institutional corruption worked and how those in power protected each other at the expense of truth and justice. She'd thought those days were behind her when she entered the classroom, but it seemed that corruption wasn't limited to police departments and government offices. It existed wherever people had power and money to protect. The next morning, Maria arrived at Riverside Academy 30 minutes early. She wanted time to observe the environment before classes started, to see how the students and faculty interacted. In the more casual pre-class atmosphere, she parked in a different spot than the day before and took a circuitous route into the building, old habits from her police days reasserting themselves. The morning energy at Riverside was markedly different from the public schools where she usually worked. Students arrived in expensive cars or were dropped off by drivers in luxury vehicles. Their clothing was designer. Their accessories were top of the line, and their casual conversations often revolved around vacation plans to exotic destinations or expensive purchases their parents had made. Maria positioned herself near the main, entrance where she could observe student interactions without being obvious about it. She watched as various social groups formed and reformed in the main hallway, noting the subtle hierarchies and power dynamics that played out through body, language, and conversation patterns. Jake Morrison arrived in a red sports car that looked like it cost more than Maria made in a year. He parked in what appeared to be a reserved spot near the main entrance, though Maria didn't see any official signage marking it as such. Tyler and Connor were waiting for him near the school entrance, and the three immediately formed a tight cluster, speaking in low voices while scanning the arriving students and faculty. As Maria watched, she noticed how other students reacted to the trio. Some approached them eagerly, clearly seeking approval or inclusion in their social circle. Others gave them a wide berth, their body language suggesting fear or discomfort. A few students seemed to actively avoid making eye contact with them at all. The faculty reactions were equally telling. Most teachers who passed by the three boys offered polite greetings, but didn't linger for conversation. Dr. Whitman hurried past them without any acknowledgement, her head down and her pace quick. Even some of the more senior faculty members seemed to treat the boys with a deference that struck Maria as inappropriate for the student-teacher relationship. Principal Morrison emerged from his office just as Maria was preparing to head to the chemistry department. He was a tall, distinguished-looking man in his 50s with graying hair and an expensive suit. When he saw his son and the other two boys, his expression softened into an indulgent smile. He approached them with the easy confidence of someone accustomed to being in charge. "Morning, boys," Principal Morrison said warmly. "Ready for another day of conquering the academic world?" Jake grinned at his father. "Always, Dad. Though, I think we might have some new challenges to deal with this year." The comment seemed innocent enough on the surface, but something in Jake's tone and the quick glances the three boys exchanged suggested a deeper meaning. Maria felt a chill of recognition as she realized they were likely talking about her. "Well, I'm sure you'll handle whatever comes your way with your usual grace and maturity," Principal Morrison replied, and Maria had to suppress a snort of disbelief at the description. "Remember, gentlemen, you're not just students here. You're representatives of the Riverside tradition. Everything you do reflects on this institution and your families." "Don't worry, Mr. Morrison," Tyler said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "We understand our responsibilities." Maria turned away before anyone could notice her watching and headed toward the chemistry department. The brief interaction she'd witnessed confirmed many of her suspicions about the power dynamics at Riverside Academy. The three students weren't just protected by their families' wealth and influence, they were actively encouraged by the administration to see themselves as special, as above the normal rules that governed other students. Mrs. Henderson's classroom felt like a refuge compared to the charged atmosphere of the main hallway. Maria spent a few minutes reviewing the day's lesson plans and setting up the equipment for the morning labs. The chemistry department was located in the newer wing of the school, with large windows that provided plenty of natural light and modern ventilation systems that kept the air fresh even during complex experiments. As the first period students began arriving, Maria noticed an immediate change in the atmosphere. Word had apparently spread about the new substitute teacher who wasn't afraid to challenge students, and the classes seemed more subdued than they had the previous day. Students followed instructions more carefully, paid closer attention to safety protocols, and asked more thoughtful questions about the material. The morning passed without incident until the third period, when Jake Morrison appeared in her doorway during the passing period between classes. He wasn't scheduled for any of her chemistry classes, which meant his presence was intentional and likely not academic in nature. "Ms. Rodriguez," he said, leaning casually against the doorframe with the kind of practiced charm that suggested he was accustomed to getting his way through charisma rather than effort. "I wanted to apologize for yesterday. I think we might have gotten off on the wrong foot." Maria looked up from her gradebook, studying his expression carefully. His smile was perfect, his posture relaxed, but there was something calculating in his eyes that put her on alert. "There's nothing to apologize for, Jake. You followed instructions and completed your assignment correctly once we clarified the requirements." "Right, exactly," he said, stepping into the classroom uninvited. "That's what I mean. I think there might have been some confusion about expectations. I wanted to make sure we're on the same page going forward." The phrasing struck Maria as odd, particularly the emphasis on expectations and being on the same page. It sounded less like a student apologizing for a minor classroom incident and more like someone trying to establish the terms of an ongoing relationship. "I'm not sure what you mean," Maria replied carefully. "My expectations are the same for all students. Follow safety protocols, complete assignments according to the given instructions, and treat everyone in the classroom with respect." Jake's smile faltered slightly, and Maria caught a glimpse of something harder underneath his polished exterior. "Of course," he said, "though I hope you understand that Riverside operates a little differently than other schools. We have certain traditions and ways of doing things that work well for everyone involved." Before Maria could respond, Tyler and Connor appeared in the doorway behind Jake. Their presence seemed to shift the energy in the room, making the space feel smaller and more threatening. Maria's police instincts kicked in automatically, and she found herself assessing potential exit routes and defensive positions. "Hey, Ms. Rodriguez," Tyler said with false cheerfulness. "Jake's right about the traditions here. It's really important to understand how things work at Riverside if you want to fit in." Connor remained silent, but his presence was somehow more menacing than his friend's words. He positioned himself so that he was blocking the main exit from the classroom, while Tyler moved to stand near the windows. The positioning felt deliberate, designed to make Maria feel trapped and surrounded. "I appreciate your concern for my adaptation to the school environment," Maria said, keeping her voice steady and professional. "But right now, I need to prepare for my next class, so if you don't have any specific academic questions, I'll need to ask you to move along to wherever you're supposed to be." The three boys exchanged glances, and Maria could see them reassessing their approach. They'd expected her to be intimidated or flustered by their presence, but her calm response seemed to surprise them. "Actually," Jake said, his tone shifting to something more serious, "we did want to talk to you about something academic. We heard you used to be a cop before you became a teacher. That's pretty interesting background for someone working in education." Maria felt her stomach tighten. The fact that they knew about her police background meant they'd been investigating her, which confirmed that yesterday's surveillance and Sarah's phone call were connected to these three students and their families. "My previous career has no bearing on my current responsibilities as your substitute teacher," she replied, "and I'm curious how you came by that information, since it's not something I've discussed with any students." "Oh, you know how it is," Tyler said with a casual shrug. "People talk, small community and all that. We just thought it was cool that you had such an interesting background. Must have been exciting work." "It was a job," Maria said simply. "And speaking of jobs, yours right now is to be in whatever class you're supposed to be attending." The bell rang 5 minutes ago. Connor finally spoke, his voice low and carrying an undertone of threat. "We don't want to keep you from your work, Ms. Rodriguez. We just wanted to make sure you understand that we're here to help if you need anything. Riverside can be a complicated place for newcomers, and it's always better to have friends than to try to navigate things alone." The word "friends" carried an obvious implication about what might happen to someone who chose not to accept their friendship. Maria had heard similar offers during her police career, usually from individuals who wanted to buy her silence or cooperation in exchange for various forms of protection or benefit. "That's very thoughtful," she replied, "but I'm quite capable of handling my responsibilities independently. Now, unless you have legitimate business in this classroom, I really do need to ask you to leave." Jake's expression hardened, and for a moment Maria saw past his polished facade to the entitled, angry young man underneath. "We're just trying to be helpful," he said, his voice taking on an edge. "It would be a shame if someone got the wrong impression about your time here." The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Maria felt a familiar surge of anger at the presumption that she could be intimidated so easily. These boys had no idea who they were dealing with, but she decided it was too early to show her hand. This wasn't random vandalism by kids with a knife. Someone used a professional blade and took their time to do it right. Maria filed away this assessment along with Frank's business card. His expert opinion would be useful if she needed to demonstrate that the vandalism was deliberate and targeted rather than random teenage mischief. By the time she'd arranged for tire replacement and caught a rideshare back to school, it was nearly lunchtime. The morning's incident had cost her several hours and several $100s, but it had also provided valuable intelligence about her opponent's capabilities and willingness to escalate their tactics. The faculty lounge during lunch period was buzzing with conversation about the morning's incident. Word of the tire slashing had spread quickly through the school's informal communication networks, and Maria found herself fielding questions and expressions of sympathy from colleagues she'd barely met. What struck her most was the pattern of responses she received. Newer faculty members, particularly those without tenure or permanent positions, expressed genuine outrage and offered various forms of support. More senior teachers, however, seemed uncomfortable discussing the incident and quickly changed the subject when it was raised. Mr. David Richardson, a veteran English teacher in his 50s, approached her during lunch with the kind of careful demeanor that suggested he had something important to communicate. He waited until they were relatively isolated near the coffee machine before speaking in low, measured tones. "Ms. Rodriguez, I wanted to express my regret about what happened to your vehicle this morning. Unfortunately, such incidents aren't entirely unprecedented here at Riverside. The administration tends to treat them as random occurrences. But those of us who've been here for a while recognize certain patterns." Maria set down her coffee and gave him her full attention. "What kind of patterns, Mr. Richardson?" He glanced around to ensure they weren't being overheard before continuing. 3 years ago, a wonderful young history teacher named Jennifer Walsh began questioning some irregularities in our athletic department's academic records. She discovered that several student athletes were receiving grades that didn't match their actual performance in class. When she brought this to the administration's attention, she initially received support and assurances that the matter would be investigated. Richardson paused, his expression growing darker. Within 2 weeks, Jennifer experienced a series of unfortunate incidents. Her car was vandalized, her apartment was broken into, though nothing was stolen, and she began receiving anonymous phone calls at all hours. The administration expressed sympathy, but suggested that perhaps the stress of teaching at such a demanding institution was affecting her judgment. Maria felt a chill of recognition at the pattern Richardson was describing. It was classic, systematic intimidation, designed to isolate the target and make them question their own perceptions while providing the institution with plausible deniability. "What happened to Ms. Walsh?" she asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "She resigned at the end of that academic year and moved out of state. The administration expressed regret at losing such a talented educator, but noted that some people simply aren't suited for the unique challenges of our environment." The grade irregularities she'd discovered were quietly addressed through what they called updated assessment protocols, but no one was ever held accountable for the original problems. Richardson's story confirmed many of Maria's suspicions. about the institutional patterns at Riverside Academy. The school had a systematic approach to dealing with troublesome faculty members, one that relied on intimidation, isolation, and the eventual voluntary departure of anyone who posed a threat to their established order. "Why are you telling me this?" Maria asked. Richardson studied her face carefully before responding. "Because Jennifer Walsh was a good teacher who cared about her students and believed in doing the right thing. When she left, we lost not just an educator but a voice for accountability in this institution. I'm hoping that someone with your background might be better equipped to handle the challenges that come with standing up to this system." The implication was clear. Richardson knew about her police background and was hoping she'd use those skills to accomplish what Jennifer Walsh couldn't. Maria appreciated his honesty, but she also recognized that he was asking her to take risks that he wasn't willing to take himself. "I appreciate the information," she told him, "and I'm sorry about what happened to your colleague. No teacher should have to endure intimidation for doing their job properly." Richardson nodded and moved away, but not before adding one final comment. "Ms. Rodriguez, if you do decide to pursue any concerns you might have about irregularities, here I'd suggest being very careful about who you trust with information. Not everyone on the faculty has the students' best interests at heart, and some have strong incentives to maintain the status quo." The warning was delivered quietly, but its implications were significant. Maria was not only dealing with hostile students and a corrupt administration, she also had to navigate a faculty where some members might be compromised or co-opted by the same system she was trying to expose. The afternoon brought her first direct classroom confrontation with Jake Morrison since the morning's intimidation tactics. He appeared in her fifth period advanced chemistry class, though according to her records, he wasn't enrolled in the course. When she questioned his presence, he produced a schedule change form that appeared legitimate, but struck her as suspiciously convenient in its timing. "I decided I needed to challenge myself academically," he explained, with the kind of earnest expression that might have fooled someone who didn't know his history. "My counselor suggested that advanced chemistry would help prepare me for pre-med studies in college." Maria examined the paperwork, noting that it had been processed that morning and signed by Dr. Whitman. The timing suggested it was a response to the morning's events, a way of placing Jake in her classroom where he could monitor her teaching and look for opportunities to create problems. "Welcome to advanced chemistry," she said neutrally. "You'll need to catch up on 3 weeks of material, including 2 major lab exercises and a comprehensive exam we completed last Friday. I'll provide you with the assignments, but you'll be responsible for mastering the content independently." Jake's confident smile faltered slightly as he realized she wasn't going to make his transition easy or provide special accommodations for his late entry into the course. "I'm sure I can handle the workload," he said. "I've always been good at science." "Excellent," Maria replied. "Then you'll have no problem with today's lab exercise on advanced titration techniques. Please take a seat at Station 12 and begin reviewing the safety protocols while I distribute today's materials." Station 12 was positioned at the back of the lab, where Jake would have a clear view of the entire classroom, but where Maria could also observe his behavior without being obvious about her surveillance. She'd chosen the placement deliberately, using techniques she'd learned during her police career for monitoring potentially problematic individuals. As the class progressed, Maria noticed that Jake's attention was focused more on observing her teaching methods and interactions with other students than on mastering the complex chemical procedures they were working with. He made several basic errors that suggested he lacked the foundational knowledge necessary for advanced chemistry, but he seemed unconcerned about his academic performance. Tyler Webb appeared at the classroom door halfway through the period, claiming he needed to deliver a message to Jake from the athletic director. The interruption was clearly designed to disrupt the class and test Maria's response to unauthorized visitors, but she handled it smoothly by directing Tyler to wait in the hallway until the lab exercise was completed. The real test came when Jake's titration experiment produced results that were wildly inaccurate due to his failure to follow proper procedures. Maria approached his station to review his work, noting the multiple errors in technique and measurement that had led to his incorrect conclusions. "Your results are significantly off from the expected values," she observed. Instead, she simply nodded and said, "I'll keep that in mind." The three students left the classroom, but not before Jake paused at the doorway to deliver one final comment. "We're glad you're keeping an open mind, Ms. Rodriguez. We think this is going to be a very educational experience for everyone involved." As soon as they were gone, Maria closed her classroom door and took a deep breath. The confrontation had been subtle but significant. The boys had made it clear that they knew about her background, that they were monitoring her activities, and that they expected her to fall in line with whatever system of control they'd established at Riverside Academy. What they didn't realize was that their intimidation tactics had just confirmed everything Maria suspected about the corruption at the school. They weren't just spoiled teenagers acting out. They were part of a systematic abuse of power that relied on threats, surveillance, and the protection of wealthy, influential families. Maria returned to her lesson preparations, but her mind was already working on a different kind of plan. She thought about the documentation she started the night before, about her conversation with Sarah, and about the resources she still had available from her law enforcement career. If Jake Morrison and his friends wanted to play games with a former police officer, she was more than ready to teach them that some opponents fought back. The following morning brought an unsettling discovery that confirmed Maria's worst suspicions about what she was dealing with at Riverside Academy. She arrived at school to find her car's tires slashed, the cuts clean and deliberate, clearly the work of someone who wanted to send a message rather than simply cause random vandalism. The parking lot security cameras, she noticed with grim irony, seemed to be conveniently angled away from where she had parked. Maria stood beside her damaged Honda, photographing the evidence with her phone while mentally calculating the cost of replacement tires against her substitute teacher's salary. The message was clear and expensive. Fall in line or face escalating consequences. What the perpetrators didn't understand was that 12 years of police work had taught her to see such tactics as confirmation that she was on the right track. People only resorted to intimidation when they had something significant to hide. Dr. Whitman appeared at her side within minutes, her nervous energy more pronounced than usual as she surveyed the damage. "Oh my goodness, Ms. Rodriguez. This is terrible. I'm so sorry this happened on school property. We'll need to file a report with our security company, though I have to warn you that these incidents rarely lead to any concrete results." The careful phrasing struck Maria immediately. These incidents, plural, suggesting this wasn't an isolated occurrence. "Has this happened to other faculty members?" she asked, continuing to document the scene while speaking. Dr. Whitman's hesitation spoke volumes. "Well, there have been some isolated problems with vandalism over the years. Nothing we could ever trace to specific individuals, you understand. The board takes security very seriously, but unfortunately, determined troublemakers can be quite creative in avoiding detection." Maria nodded, filing away another piece of evidence about the school's pattern of enabling problematic behavior while maintaining plausible deniability. "I'll need to call for a tow truck and arrange for replacement tires. Will this make me late for first period?" "Don't worry about that," Dr. Whitman said quickly. "I'll have someone cover your morning classes. The important thing is that you're safe. These things happen, unfortunately, but they're usually isolated incidents that don't repeat themselves." The implication was clear. This was a warning, not an ongoing campaign, and it would stop if Maria learned the intended lesson. She smiled politely and thanked Dr. Whitman for her understanding, all while mentally noting every detail of the conversation for her growing file. As she waited for the tow truck, Maria called Sarah Chen from her personal phone, stepping away from the building to ensure privacy. Her former partner answered on the second ring, her voice immediately alert despite the early hour. They escalated, Maria said without preamble. Slashed tires, professional job, clearly intended as intimidation rather than random vandalism. Sarah's response was immediate and concerned. Maria, this is getting serious. Someone with resources is behind this, and they're willing to commit crimes to send their message. Have you considered backing away from whatever situation you've stumbled into? Every day, Maria admitted. But Sarah, if I walk away now, nothing changes. These kids will continue terrorizing faculty and students, and the administration will keep covering for them because of family money and political connections. Someone has to stand up to this system. I understand the principle, but I'm worried about your safety. Look, I've been doing some quiet checking on those names you gave me yesterday. The families you're dealing with have serious political connections at the state level. Jake Morrison's grandfather is a major donor to the governor's campaigns. Tyler Webb's father sits on the state education board, and Connor Sullivan's family owns a construction company that has multi-million-dollar contracts with the school district. Maria felt pieces clicking into place as Sarah continued. These aren't just wealthy families throwing money around. They're part of a network that has the power to destroy careers, manipulate investigations, and make problems disappear. You're not just dealing with spoiled teenagers and a corrupt principal. You're up against a system that has layers of protection you haven't even discovered yet. The information was sobering, but not surprising. During her police career, Maria had seen how interconnected networks of wealth and political influence operated to protect their members from consequences. What made this situation particularly dangerous was that she was essentially operating alone, without the institutional support and legal protection she'd had as a police officer. I hear you, she told Sarah, but I also know that these systems rely on people being too afraid or too isolated to fight back effectively. They expect me to be intimidated by last night's phone calls and this morning's vandalism. What they don't expect is someone who knows how to investigate, document evidence, and build a case that can't be dismissed or covered up. Sarah sighed, recognizing the tone that meant Maria had made up her mind. All right, but promise me, you'll be smart about this. Document everything, stay in public spaces when possible, and keep me informed of any developments. And Maria, if things escalate beyond intimidation tactics, call me immediately. I can't officially investigate something outside my jurisdiction, but I can make sure you have backup if you need it. After ending the call, Maria spent the rest of the morning dealing with the practical aspects of the tire slashing. The tow truck driver, a grizzled man in his 60s named Frank, examined the damage with professional interest. Whoever did this knew what they were doing, he commented, pointing to the precise cuts. Clean slices, positioned to cause maximum damage without being immediately noticeable. Can you identify where the procedure went wrong? Jake's jaw tightened as he realized his mistakes were being highlighted in front of the other students. The equipment must be defective, he said loudly enough for the entire class to hear. There's no way I could have made errors when I followed the instructions exactly. Maria had been expecting this response. Rather than confronting him directly, she simply nodded and said, "Let's test that theory. Please repeat the procedure using a different set of equipment while I observe your technique." The suggestion put Jake in an impossible position. If he repeated the exercise properly, his original excuse would be exposed as false. If he continued making errors, his incompetence would be demonstrated publicly. Either outcome would damage his carefully constructed image of effortless superiority. "I don't think that's necessary," he said, his tone taking on an edge of hostility. "I'm confident in my results, and I don't appreciate having my work questioned in front of other students." The challenge was direct and public, designed to test whether Maria would back down from confronting him when other students were watching. She recognized it as a crucial moment that would establish the dynamics for all future interactions. "In advanced chemistry, all results are subject to verification and analysis," she replied calmly. "That's not a reflection on any individual student's abilities. It's simply how scientific inquiry works. If you're uncomfortable with that process, you might want to consider whether this course is the right fit for your academic goals." The response was perfectly reasonable and professional, but it effectively called Jake's bluff while giving him an opportunity to withdraw gracefully. Instead of taking the exit she'd offered, he chose to escalate further. "I think you're singling me out because of who I am," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the now silent laboratory. "Maybe you have some kind of bias against students from certain families." The accusation was calculated to put Maria in a defensive position and to introduce the suggestion that any criticism of his performance was motivated by personal prejudice rather than academic standards. She recognized it as a sophisticated manipulation tactic, likely coached by adults who understood how to weaponize allegations of bias. "I evaluate all students based on the same academic criteria," Maria responded. "Your family background has no bearing on my assessment of your laboratory technique or your understanding of chemical principles. However, if you feel you're being treated unfairly, you're welcome to discuss your concerns with Dr. Whitman or Principal Morrison." By suggesting he take his complaints to the administration, Maria was calling his bluff while demonstrating that she wasn't intimidated by his implied threats. She also suspected that involving the administration might reveal useful information about how the school typically handled such situations. Jake seemed caught off guard by her suggestion that he involve his father in what was ostensibly a minor academic dispute. He apparently hadn't expected her to encourage the very escalation he'd been threatening to pursue. "That won't be necessary," he said, backing down slightly. "I'm sure we can work things out between us." Maria nodded and moved on to assist other students, but she'd learned valuable information from the exchange. Jake was comfortable making threats and accusations, but he seemed reluctant to actually follow through when called on his bluffing. That suggested his power was more psychological than real, at least in direct academic confrontations. The incident also revealed something important about the other students in the class. Several had watched the exchange with obvious interest, and she noticed approving glances from a few who seemed pleased to see Jake challenged academically. Not all of Riverside's students were intimidated by or supportive of the toxic behavior that Jake and his friends represented. After class, as students were packing up their materials, a quiet junior named Lisa Chen approached Maria's desk. Lisa was one of the top performers in the class, consistently producing excellent work while maintaining a low profile socially. "Ms. Rodriguez," she said quietly, glancing around to make sure Jake had left the classroom, "I wanted to thank you for maintaining academic standards in here. Some of us really appreciate having a teacher who treats everyone the same way." The comment was carefully phrased, but its meaning was clear. Lisa and presumably other serious students had been frustrated by teachers who gave special treatment to privileged students like Jake. Maria's willingness to hold him to the same standards as everyone else was apparently unusual enough to merit gratitude. "That's very kind of you to say, Lisa. I believe all students benefit when we maintain consistent expectations and provide everyone with the support they need to meet those standards." Lisa nodded and gathered her materials. But before leaving, she paused and added, If you ever need witnesses to anything that happens in class, there are several of us who pay attention to everything and take detailed notes. The offer was subtly delivered, but significant in its implications. Lisa was essentially volunteering to provide testimony if Maria ever needed to document improper behavior or defend her teaching methods. The fact that she felt the need to make such an offer suggested that previous teachers had faced situations where their version of events was disputed by students or administrators. The remainder of the afternoon passed without major incidents, but Maria noticed an increase in subtle harassment that suggested her opponents were probing for weaknesses while avoiding direct confrontation. Her classroom supplies were mysteriously disorganized between periods, requiring extra time to prepare for each class. Anonymous notes appeared in her mailbox, making vague references to her police background and suggesting that she might not be suited for an educational environment. Most significantly, she began noticing increased surveillance of her activities. Students who weren't in her classes appeared in the hallways near her classroom during passing periods, apparently observing her interactions with faculty and students. The black SUV from her first day appeared in the parking lot again, though it maintained enough distance to avoid being obviously threatening. During her planning period, Maria used the school's computer system to research the academic records of Jake, Tyler, and Connor. What she discovered confirmed her suspicions about the systematic corruption that protected these students from consequences. All three boys had notably inconsistent grade patterns, with dramatic improvements in their marks, coinciding with important athletic seasons or college application deadlines. Connor Sullivan's transcript showed a remarkable transformation from C and D grades in his freshman and sophomore years to straight A's in advanced courses during his junior year, exactly when college scouts would have been evaluating his academic qualifications. More concerning were the disciplinary records, which showed multiple incidents that had been either dismissed or substantially reduced in severity. Jake Morrison had been accused of academic dishonesty 3 separate times, but each investigation had concluded with insufficient evidence, despite testimony from multiple faculty members. Tyler Webb's file contained reports of harassment and intimidation directed at other students, but these incidents were consistently classified as misunderstandings or personality conflicts that were resolved through mediation rather than formal discipline. The pattern was clear and systematic. Serious academic and disciplinary problems were being concealed or minimized to protect these students' college prospects and athletic eligibility. The corruption wasn't limited to enabling bad behavior. It extended to actively falsifying the official record of their performance at Riverside Academy. Maria printed copies of the relevant documents, though she suspected they might be altered or removed once her research activities were discovered. She also began cross-referencing the boys' schedules with faculty assignments, looking for patterns that might reveal which teachers were cooperating with the grade manipulation scheme. Her investigation was interrupted by a knock on her classroom door. Dr. Whitman entered with the kind of nervous energy that suggested she was delivering unwelcome news. "Ms. Rodriguez, I hope you don't mind the interruption, but I wanted to follow up on this morning's incident with your vehicle. Our security company has completed their initial review of the camera footage, and unfortunately, they weren't able to identify any suspects or witnesses to the vandalism." Maria wasn't surprised by this finding, given the convenient positioning of the cameras she'd observed that morning. "That's disappointing but not unexpected. Have there been similar incidents recently that might suggest a pattern of vandalism on school property?" Dr. Whitman's hesitation was telling. "Well, there have been some isolated incidents over the years, but nothing that would suggest an organized campaign against faculty members. These things tend to be random acts by individuals who have no connection to our school community." The carefully worded response was clearly designed to discourage Maria from pursuing the matter further or looking for connections between her situation and previous incidents involving other faculty members. "I see," Maria said neutrally. "Well, I appreciate the school's efforts to investigate the matter. I've filed a report with my insurance company, and they may have additional questions about security measures and previous incidents if they decide to pursue recovery of the damages." Dr. Whitman's expression tightened at the mention of insurance investigators asking questions about security and previous incidents. "Of course, we'll cooperate fully with any legitimate inquiries, though I should mention that insurance companies sometimes have unrealistic expectations about what security measures can accomplish in preventing determined criminal behavior." The response revealed that the school was prepared to defend their security arrangements and deny responsibility for incidents that occurred on their property. It also suggested they had experience dealing with insurance claims related to faculty vehicle damage, which supported the idea that Maria's situation wasn't as isolated as they were claiming. After Dr. Whitman left, Maria continued her research into the academic records, but she also began documenting the administration's responses to her complaints and inquiries. The pattern of dismissive responses and deflection tactics would be important evidence if she eventually needed to demonstrate that the school was failing to address known problems. Her afternoon classes proceeded without major disruptions, though she noticed that Jake Morrison's behavior had shifted since their lunchtime confrontation. Rather than making direct challenges to her authority, he was now focusing on subtle disruptions designed to undermine her credibility with other students. He asked unnecessarily complex questions that were clearly intended to consume class time and test her knowledge rather than advance his understanding of the material. When she provided comprehensive answers, he responded with exaggerated note-taking and comments like, "Wow, I never thought about it that way," that seemed designed to mock her expertise. During group work, he positioned himself so that he could observe and comment on other students' interactions with her. When classmates asked for help or clarification, Jake would interject with suggestions that contradicted her instructions, or implied that there were easier ways to complete the assignments. The tactics were sophisticated and clearly designed to gradually erode her authority in the classroom without providing grounds for direct disciplinary action. Maria recognized the approach from her police work, where skilled criminals often use similar methods to undermine investigations and create doubt about law enforcement credibility. By the end of the school day, Maria had documented multiple incidents of harassment, gathered evidence of academic corruption, and identified several faculty members who might be willing to provide information about the systemic problems at Riverside Academy. She had also confirmed that she was dealing with opponents who had significant resources and sophisticated tactics at their disposal. As she prepared to leave the building, Maria reflected on the day's events and planned her next steps. The tire slashing had been intended to intimidate her into backing down, but instead it had provided evidence of escalating criminal behavior. Jake's enrollment in her class was designed to give him opportunities to create problems for her, but it also gave her a chance to document his academic deficiencies and inappropriate behavior. Most importantly, the day had revealed that there were people at Riverside Academy who were willing to support accountability and reform, even if they weren't yet ready to take public stands against the corruption they witnessed. Students like Lisa Chen and faculty members like David Richardson represented potential allies who could provide crucial support if Maria decided to pursue formal action against the systematic problems she was uncovering. The black SUV was waiting in the parking lot again as Maria walked to her replacement rental car, This time, she decided to take a more direct approach to the surveillance. Instead of pretending not to notice the vehicle, she walked directly toward it while pulling out her phone to record video. The SUV's engine started immediately, and it pulled away before she could get close enough to identify the occupants or get clear footage of the license plate. The hasty departure suggested that whoever was conducting the surveillance wasn't prepared for direct confrontation and might be more vulnerable than their intimidation tactics implied. As Maria drove home, she called Sarah Chen to update her on the day's developments. Her former partner listened with growing concern as Maria described the escalating harassment and the evidence of systematic corruption she was uncovering. "Maria, this is getting way beyond what any substitute teacher should have to deal with," Sarah said. "You're essentially conducting a solo investigation into a criminal conspiracy that involves wealthy, politically connected families. Even with your police background, you don't have the resources or legal authority to pursue this safely." "I know the risks," Maria replied, "but I also know that if I walk away now, nothing will change. These families will continue using their wealth and influence to protect their children from consequences, and more teachers and students will be victimized by this system." Sarah was quiet for a moment before responding. "All right. But if you're determined to pursue this, you need to be smarter about it. You're gathering evidence piecemeal and reacting to their moves instead of controlling the situation. If you really want to expose this corruption, you need to think like a detective building a case rather than a teacher trying to survive the school day." The advice resonated with Maria as she considered her options. Sarah was right that she'd been operating defensively, responding to intimidation and harassment, instead of actively investigating the full scope of the corruption at Riverside Academy. "What would you do if this were your case?" Maria asked. "I'd start by identifying all the players and understanding their relationships and vulnerabilities. I'd look for patterns in their behavior and financial arrangements that might reveal criminal activity beyond just grade manipulation. Most importantly, I'd find a way to gather evidence without them knowing I was building a case against them." Sarah's suggestions sparked ideas about how Maria might use her position as a substitute teacher to gather intelligence while appearing to comply with the pressure to stay quiet and avoid causing problems. "One more thing," Sarah added before ending the call. "If you're going to do this, you need to accept that it might cost you your teaching career and possibly expose you to serious retaliation. These people have already demonstrated they're willing to commit crimes to protect their interests. Are you prepared for what might happen if they decide you're too dangerous to intimidate?" Maria thought about the question as she pulled into her driveway. The day's events had shown her that Jake Morrison and his allies were escalating their tactics and becoming more desperate to neutralize her as a threat. The systematic corruption at Riverside Academy was more extensive than she'd initially realized, and exposing it would require taking significant personal risks. But as she sat in her car, looking at her modest home and thinking about the teachers and students who were being victimized by the toxic culture at Riverside Academy, Maria realized that backing down wasn't really an option. She'd become a police officer because she believed in justice and protecting people who couldn't protect themselves. Those same principles applied to her current situation, even if the setting and circumstances were different. She was no longer just a substitute teacher trying to survive a difficult assignment. She was a former police officer who had stumbled onto evidence of systematic corruption and criminal behavior. The question wasn't whether she should pursue the investigation, but how she could do it effectively while minimizing the risks to herself and maximizing the chances of achieving lasting reform. Maria gathered her materials and headed inside, her mind already working on a plan that would use her unique combination of investigative skills and educational access to build a case that couldn't be dismissed or covered up. Jake Morrison and his allies had made a critical error in underestimating their opponent. They were about to discover that their newest target had resources and capabilities they hadn't anticipated. The real investigation was just beginning. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.